All right. Here we are back again. Last week, or whatever consistency we'll put these out, we talked about some fictional writings by was it
Edward Bulwer-Lytton.
Yes, and this idea of the Vril, and how they started to interweave that into a plan, which originated in Germany, and
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you take
Sure.
it.
No, I'm glad you mentioned about the book, The Coming Race by Edward Bulwer-Lytton. It's going to prove to be a very important point that while that was a fiction, a science fiction book, it was a allegory for a very real belief system, namely Babel's belief system, their belief system of descent from Anunnaki, the bloodlines. But that was always their style, to package these truths in fiction, to hide them within the safety of fiction, including the Arthurian tales, since the Knights Templar.
Okay.
That was an allegory for the Merovingian bloodlines of supposed descent from the the Anunnaki strain, and the so-called, or the Dionysian bloodline, the so-called claimed bloodline of Jesus, which is part of the Gnostic narrative around him.
Yeah.
Which neither you or I accept, for the record, so that there's no confusion.
Yeah.
But we're dealing in their belief system.
Well, and let's say that was true. I mean, like for folks, who believe in the gospel and the things that had to come into place for there to be a gospel and for the sacrifice, pure sacrifice to, wouldn't it pollute the whole thing? Wouldn't it? I mean, it would completely change the whole thing. Like I remember I had friends, talking about, Jesus, he did sex magic and he went over to Egypt and he learned all this stuff and he learned how to slow his heartbeat down and he didn't really die and he just and it's like, well, then that's not good news. And like, we have to,
right. That's the Gnostic gospel.
Yes. And if that's the case, well, then that's what we should be doing to be like Jesus. You know what I mean?
Well, what's the bottom line of what they're trying to hold on to? And this is what I'm talking about in what I've referred to as Babel's counterfeit Christology pattern. And it goes back to even before Jesus, where they're copying all of the throne room motifs of Scripture.
Yeah.
They're making their own version of the temple. And this goes back to when even King Manasseh, from the line of Judah, rebelled against Yahweh, and everything his father Hezekiah had done to purge paganism from the land, he brings it right back in and sets up these pagan zodiac altars right in the temple. And even there's these chariots of the sun that are dedicated to the temple. And this whole Merkava tradition comes up, which is one of Babel's system, using all of the Jerusalem temple's props and theology to try to weave in their own narrative. So what they're holding on to, what they're trying to preserve in all of that, what they're fighting for, is to have this exclusive rather than democratizable theology, where it's all about their special bloodline. And so, yes, if Jesus, the problem with the Gnostic tradition around Jesus is, if that's where Jesus, and their narrative, same thing about Solomon. Oh, he got his wisdom from this ancient pagan tradition. Well, if that's true, then it's as Paul says. Then of course the New Testament falls apart. The whole point of what Jesus did, rooted in the Old Testament narrative and doctrine, is to bring humankind with him into the Trinity. He ascended to the throne room as the Son of Man, and his blood that purchased humanity for that purpose was very specifically according to a certain according to a non-Nephilim bloodline. Mm. That's the whole point of being careful to trace that genealogy.
Well, and that's what they're trying to do.
Two bloodlines together and say, no, they were all bloodline one, so they're just always flipping the narrative.
Yeah. And it's like an effort to pollute the bloodline, right, to corrupt, to prevent what needed to be happen. It seems to be
right.
There's this obsession with blood. Why? You
right.
know what I mean?
And so the whole Aryan mythos that was behind the Nazis, some people say, well, why did they pick on the Jews and not the Christians? Because their hardcore members who we're about to talk about hated the Christians just as much as the Jews, because they knew that it was all the same tradition coming from Yahweh, coming from the Old Testament. But what they did was they flipped the script with Christianity and created an Aryan Jesus, essentially their agnostic Merovingian Jesus, which, they say he was blonde, blue-eyed, and he was more of a, they tried to take out from beneath him his Jewish heritage and, that sort of thing. Yeah. So the one thing the big point I made last time was that every ingredient that went into Nazism can be traced back and derived from Illuminized Freemasonry. That's part of what the point I was making when talking about the Vril and talking about the Edward Bulwer-Lytton, the author, who is a ranking Rosicrucian Mason, part of that tradition. And one of the things I meant to insert, and I'll just insert it now. There have been 3 times in history, in recent history, that is, in the last 200 years, where high Masonry, Illuminized Masonry, has showed us its true colors. Nazism and that whole Vril business was one of them, which I talked about last time. Another occasion was Albert Pike himself. We've got to understand that the whole Confederate tradition in the Civil War came right out of high Masonry. Albert Pike was the one who helped construct the Constitution of the Confederacy. He was part of a plot to enslave the Caribbean and Mexico and non-white peoples.
Yeah.
This is typical Aryan thinking.
Yeah.
That's why he wrote a book about Aryanism and the Aryan gods. And he was even part of an assassin, or 2, I think it might be 2, at least one assassination plot against Lincoln. He was traced to that, John Wilkes Booth. He was also fundamental, Albert Pike, in creating the KKK, which originated beforehand as Knights of the Golden Dawn, an arm of Masonry that was all part of the Civil War plot to divide America. And so that's the second time. Pike constitutes the second time we've seen the true colors of Freemasonry, and it's full-blown kind of Nazism, if you will. It's white supremacy. The third occasion was the Cecil Rhodes Society. That is also known as the Rhodes Round Table. Now, these were the guys that I think I've talked about a little bit before. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, these were the bankers who overtook our financial systems in New York. They were the ones who set up the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
These are the guys like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Paul Warburg.
This would be that book, Creature from the Black Lagoon, I believe is. No, excuse me, A Creature from Jekyll Island. Excuse me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Great. Yeah, that's a great book on all of this.
Yeah.
Of this, what I'm talking about. They were part of this branch. They were called the Pilgrim Society, in mockery of the United States and its purpose. But they were just the American arm of the British Rhodes Round Table. That's where, and the British Rhodes Round Table was a Rothschild by Cecil Rhodes and Lord Nathan Rothschild. That was just the English arm of the Illuminized Freemasonry. And just to throw in a quick part, they were part of the Apollo, ranking Oxford's Apollo Masonic Society. And Apollo was a charioteer god, and it's always going to come back to these charioteer gods in ancient Mesopotamia and the Semitic gods of Phoenicia, that all got caught up in this Merkaba mysticism. Okay, so how are they the third case in which high Freemasonry shows us its true colors? Well, Cecil Rhodes, he was the man who founded the diamond and other types of mining, valuable mineral mining industries in Africa. And his goal was to paint, in his words, paint Africa British red, and to enslave the African continent and use them as workers for the Masonic diamond industry, the Rothschild diamond industry. And that's part of how they gained some of their great wealth. The British Rhodes Round Table is in fact named after the Arthurian motif, because again, they're believing that this, what I'm going to call the counterfeit Christ bloodline, went through Arthur and the Templars and that whole batch of Pan-Germanic Celtic royalty of the Aryan race / Merovingian race. Okay. So those are three occasions, and we've at some point we got to start learning from history that it's all coming from the same stream,
right?
Which is descent from what they believe to be the blonde, blue-eyed gods. Now, last time I talked about this in the context of the Vril Society, but I didn't make clear how the Vril Society connected to Nazism. Now, to refresh people's memories, the Vril Society is fomenting in the early 1900s gradually. Or some people say, well, what about the Thule Society? Well, what happened was the Vril Society was like this inner circle of high Masons from these different streams, illuminized streams that all came together. Let's just say 1917, 1918, it starts to build. And I talked about Maria Orsic and some of these other guys like Sir Bottendorf. And they did the classic Masonic thing, classic Gnostic secret society thing of forming an outer shell. That was what we called the Thule Society. And in keeping with the direction laid out by Adam Weishaupt almost 2 centuries earlier in the Illuminized Freemasonry with the Rothschild, his advice was it's always good to put our secret societies within literary or reading or publication societies so that we can turn the public mind which way we will. In other words, literature, propaganda, education. That's what Skull and Bones was. And so they created the Thule Society as an organization for reviving occult literature in Germany, to get people back in touch with this supposed Aryan, or with the Pan-Germanic pagan Babylonian past. And so that was related to some of those famous images you might see nowadays of it's in color, high definition, of them marching through the streets in those goddess and hero god motifs. And in time, in the 20s, as the Thule Society, the outer shell of the Vril, builds up, the Thule Society will become the Nazi Party in political form. And the Vril Society remaining at the center of it, some people would equate the Vril Society at the center there with the Order of the Black Sun, which is synonymous. I guess you could identify that with the swastika, or alternatively with some other symbols, including the Merovingian Black Sun with 12 lightning-like spokes of a wheel, which is related to the Merkaba tradition. And the Vril Society started to recruit at some point where it starts to really take off and gain traction politically as a powerful, and let us never forget, this happened within the context of democracy. They sold themselves to the public as a party of the people. And as the Nazi Party. And some of their 5 most important inner circle members of the Vril came to include. Now, World War II history buffs will recognize these names, but there was General Karl Haushofer. He ends up becoming a powerful Nazi general. Rudolf Hess, who was to be Hitler's successor if Hitler were to be assassinated. And Rudolf Hess, in fact, brought Rudolf Hitler, into the party as a young man. And there was a man named Dietrich Eckart who called himself the John the Baptist and said that in Hitler he recognized their Messiah. And then there was Heinrich Himmler, who ends up becoming the head of their most elite military unit and special forces, and then ultimately their special weapons program. Martin Bormann, who ends up becoming the head of the Nazi Party, and Hermann Goering, who becomes the head of the Luftwaffe or Air Force. Now, all 5 of these guys, as I said, became part of this inner circle Vril. So they were deeply initiated, and in black magic. They didn't even pretend to play the game of white magic in this case. General Haushofer would lead annual trips to Tibet to meet with, to bring his soldiers, who end up becoming the SS, the special Heinrich Himmler's special military unit, who, by the way, the SS were initially funded by those 6 men I always talk about, or specifically Averell Harriman and Prescott Bush from Wall Street. They're funding this in the early 1930s.
Wow.
And the SS under Karl Haushofer would take, in the 20s, 30s, at some point in there, annual trips to Tibet and initiate their soldiers. They would go underneath in the underground areas and meet with the supposed remaining ancestors of the Aryan race from the Ananurba star system we talked about last time, with whom Marie Orsic was in telepathic contact. And they were initiated. That's where they received their initiation in the dark arts. They learned about the adept powers. And also, the SS soldiers, to qualify, had to meet a certain genetic strain. That is to say, they had to prove their ancestry, their relatively pure Aryan ancestry back to some year. I think it was 18-something or 17-something. And they had to be a certain height. They had to be the Aryan archetype of physical specimen perfection. Because that's what was necessary to begin reconverging what they believed to be their sacred Germanic gene pool back with these ancient gods. For these ancient gods to come up out of their underground dwellings and make a comeback on Earth. Okay, so the other interesting thing about Heinrich Himmler, why he's such a pivotal point in all of this, is him and Martin Bormann, who are the 2 most ardent Satanists of this group, and they hate Christians as much as they hate Jews, and they're just the most radically initiated and committed devotees of these dark arts. They are the ones that are going to end up taking control of the Nazi wonder weapons program. It's Heinrich Himmler who's going to send teams all out throughout the world with what he called the Ananurba, a branch of the SS, and they're going to gather information about all of these blonde and blue-eyed gods. They're going to send teams to South America to even look for these elongated skulls that you hear a lot about on the History Channel. They are searching for ancient occult artifacts, especially the Holy Grail, anything that will that will reinforce their narrative about their Aryan heritage, the Atlantean mythos, and any occult artifacts that could be weaponizable. And it is really interesting. There were a lot of intrigues in 1944 that would suggest they found a Templar treasure, whereupon after finding this treasure in 1944, suddenly their wonder weapons explode. Their wonder weapon program explodes, and their pursuit of rocketry, of an aerospace program, of things that were already in the works, including some of these Vril levitation saucer types that they had been developing, suddenly take off. The success of these programs is just exponentially accelerates. This is again in 1944. And within this program by Heinrich Himmler, who was marked by the skull and who marked his SS with the skull and bones insignia, a head nod to Illuminized Freemasonry since Adam Weishaupt, that's their symbol, and to their brethren in the United States, the skull and bones. They started developing all kinds of weapons, including lasers, including they just their rocketry with. I'm sorry, I was going to say this included Werner von Braun and others of the Nazi rocket science pedigree, the superstars of Himmler's rocket program or wonder weapons program. And they end up sending the rocket in that's June of 1944, I think it was, or September, or one of the two. They end up sending the rocket to become the first object that penetrates outer space. Before you know it, they have a space program in the making. Behind the scenes in all of this, it's very fascinating. Allen Dulles, and okay, let me slow down and make a very important point here. That what for me was a huge milestone in this project and meant a lot to me. It was as early as 1942 that Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann, two of these inner core of the Vril that they got together, these two men, and they started even making a plan against Hitler. And they started saying, look, there's a chance we might not win this war, no matter how advanced our technology program takes off. We need to have a backup plan to where when this ship sinks, we have a place to jump. I discovered in a book that this meeting took place on November 7th, 1942. I had gotten to know their Masonic way of thinking so well by this point, and the nature of their relationship with the Masons in the United States, those Super Six I always talk about so well at this point. I reasoned with myself. For them to make that decision, they knew that they were going to need the help of one of these powerful guys back home, Allen Dulles of the CIA, not yet the CIA director, but the man to become that. And he was already in negotiation. I said, Allen, those guys who were really powerful, Allen Dulles, Avril Harriman, I figured they needed to somehow bring them into the loop. I was having this thought. I kid you not, no exaggeration. When there was this other book lying on my desk that shouldn't have even been there because I just happened to take it the other day to look up something random, but I hadn't even, it was a totally unrelated matter, but something in me said, reach for that book. And I reached for it. And this book that I reached for was a book by, it was a biography on Allen Dulles, great book. In fact, I'm just going to even promote it because it was so good. The Devil's Chessboard. And you can see how worn it is because I made every use of this thing. So I open it up, and it goes right to a page where the first thing that jumps out of my eye is the date November 9th, 1942. And I immediately recognized that as 2 days after the day of meeting between Himmler and Martin Bormann when they start to make this plot. And so I read to find out, oh my goodness, that was 2 days later is when Avril Harriman went. He was then with the OSS, the CIA's precursor, and he moves to Switzerland. And over those next 2 months, he starts meeting with Himmler's aide. With Himmler's aide, they start meeting and setting up this plan about how they're going to throw Hitler under the bus.
Wow.
And ultimately transplant the best of that Nazism had to offer over to the United States, which will end up being their weapons program.
Wow.
And what's the ultimate common bond we're dealing with here? Illuminized Freemasonry. It's that simple. So I include that connection in my book. That actually all happened. I've never found anybody that connected those dots, but those dots were connected for me. Frankly, I believe God was leading me to discover that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's actually that is what ends up happening in the 1940s. In fact, 1944, that's when it all speeds up. And they start plotting with those 6 men, especially Nelson Rockefeller in the United States, Nelson Rockefeller, Allen Dulles, and then Avril Harriman and Prescott Bush with their banking network started to help the Nazis transfer all of their most valuable assets, like IG Farben, the industry cartel, over into all of these other new companies and shell organizations they start forming all over the world. There's like a total of 700. There's a massive Operation Eagle Flight. And then it's through Operation Paperclip that so many of us hear about nowadays, where they transplanted the Nazi aerospace program that was in the making. And this is going to end up becoming multiple programs. All of those 1,400 or whatever it was scientists from Himmler's SS that they end up. Oh, and by the way, the official narrative was that Martin Bormann supposedly died. He didn't. All evidence points to the fact that he escaped Argentina and lived as a billionaire. And the story behind Heinrich Himmler, the other guy, is that he was he killed himself by biting on a cyanide tablet. But that seems to be true, but that was only because a plan went south. Allen Dulles had tried to help him escape too. But the plan failed. There was something went south, and anyways, it didn't work out, so he killed himself. But Allen Dulles certainly did. And this is the kind of brotherhood we're talking about. And by the way, the huge Nazi remnant that was helped to escape with help from the Vatican, Jesuits in the Vatican, the whole Masonic network, the whole secret society. This is where all those branches of the secret society we've talked about, the Gnostic secret, you find them all collaborating in this event of Nazism's transfer to the United States in one form or another. It's amazing. And so with this transfer to the United States, we end up, a few programs end up developing. NASA, or we'll just call it the aerospace program. And there's 2 levels to that. There's the public facade, NASA, it recruits. It runs largely on Werner von Braun and his Nazi team, and Hermann Oberth, who was the other lead scientist for the Nazis. But even NASA is going to be very secretive in itself, and that's going to be Masonically exclusive. If you look at their administrators since the early 60s, it was one of two things. It was either ranking Masons, or one of three things: ranking Masons, ranking Nazis, or ranking members of the OTO from which we talked a little bit last time. That was Aleister Crowley's Masonic branch of black magic, started by Jack Parsons in the Jet Propulsion Lab in California.
Yeah.
The other level of the United States Aerospace Program is the one now they're just finally admitting to, as of the last month even. And that was the kind of intrigues we have stirring at Area 51, Wright-Patterson, of electrogravitic Nazi saucer types. And let's see, we also have, the CIA itself ends up developing from this huge transfer in 1947. And we have MK Ultra and the programs within the CIA, the deepest research programs, including the Area 51 programs of reverse engineering that went on. All of those were a deep collaboration between, at their most administrative level, between Skull and Bones, Nazis, and 33rd degree Masons. So the pattern just doesn't let you down at this point.
And didn't the Disney spring up around this time too? And Allen Dulles was involved there too, right?
Okay, here's a good story. Yes, so Disney, the CIA helped secure the land for Disney because it was to be a major part of MK Ultra, actually a very major part of Operation Mockingbird to take over the media, which they also use Nazi propagandists for. Disney's figurehead, Walt Disney, was a 33rd degree Mason, so he's part of the club here. And he ends up partnering with Werner von Braun, I think it was in 1955, to create a series of studio productions on putting man on the moon that was needed to help prepare public support for NASA. What is so fascinating about those videos, and you can look them up, is that you could go on YouTube even and put in the videos about Walt Disney and the moon landing, and they're preparing. It was just like a full production. I can't remember what the name was, but it's basically you have these actors who are taking you through, and Werner von Braun narrates it. He hosts the program and takes you through what it will look like to put a man on the moon. And there are these movie-like scenes where they have a crew of, I think it was 3 or 4 astronauts, something like that, within a space capsule. And as they're approaching the moon, you can see this. Something really, I think, eye-opening happens. They are about to approach the dark side of the moon. And the music starts to intensify. And the captain says, "Ready the flares." And they're going to send out, once they cross that boundary onto the dark side of the moon, they're going to send out intervaled, timed flares, light flares that will light up the space below them, because apparently there's something down there below that they want to see, that they're looking for, that they were prepared to look for. And the first flare goes off, and all they see are more craters, natural formations. The musical score is disappointed. It's like wah, 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 or something like that. Then they send off the second flare a minute later. Wah, wah, wah. The intensity builds. The third flare, or whichever one it was, and wah, wah, wah. finally, whenever they send off that last flare, suddenly, the surface of the moon lights up, and you have this music that it's suddenly victorious, and it's like epiphany like, and you see, rather than natural formations this time, you see what are clearly rectangular artificial structures indicating ruins of some sort that are down there.
Wow.
Now, nobody ever says anything. Werner von Braun, as the narrator, never says anything. And that all happened at the 33rd parallel of the moon, because it's when they send the 33rd, the last flare, that one of the crew members says, "Captain, I'm getting a reading, an anomaly or something like that at the 33rd parallel." And so he says, "Okay, send the last flare." And, that's when that happens. Now, that number 33 keeps popping up everywhere in NASA.
Yeah.
And it's since become known very clearly, this isn't theory, that NASA was very intentional about their launch dates, their astrological circumstances, and it's since even been discovered that the patchwork that they would wear, named after these ancient mystery school gods, Apollo, Mercury, very important in tradition, were very cultic.
Yeah.
You almost sound like you wanted to interject with something.
Oh no, I just never thought about that. All those spaceship names.
All right, so what is? There's just so much coming out about nowadays about this secret space program or aerospace program that's existed that you would have really suspected anyway if you were really tracking with this history. I'm I guess I'm wondering if I should just jump ahead now. Okay, yeah. No, actually, let me connect an important dot here.
Okay.
There has always been, in the CIA's reverse engineering program or UFO programs, whatever all they entail, they always came and developed in deep overlap with MK Ultra. It's fascinating. And I should add, along with the UN, because all of these guys I mentioned, the Super Six, Nelson Rockefeller and Allen Dulles, and then John Foster Dulles, they were also developing the UN at the same time. In fact, their major work on the UN, their charter, was done in the same fall of 1944, when they were busy getting all of this transfer of Nazis underway. It's as if what Hitler once called the New Order, they were now repackaging into the New World Order. And Nazism was going to change its face.
Gotcha.
It was going to get more deceptive. And the United Nations even decided to adopt all of Illuminized Freemasonry as its official religion that they were going to promote. Of course, they didn't put it that way. They gave it a new spin, referring to it as New Age, etc. But they are drawing upon all the same sources as Nazism. Madame Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, and Masonic authors. And with this plan to draw, which was always in place and articulated by Adam Weishaupt, articulated by Albert Pike, to gradually draw the world toward Luciferianism, Illuminism, Babel system, whatever you'd like to call it. This UFO and alien cult religion has been propagated with it. And in the 1950s, here we go. Here's another eye opener. In the 1950s, early 1950s, there were the man who began to really popularize the whole kind of ET religion, ET Gnostic, their version of a gospel, was a man named Adamski, George Adamski. This is in California, 1953. and he starts talking about how he's receiving visits from a Venusian. And well, guess what? George Adamski had a little Masonic society called the Tibetan Order, and it was the exact same theology or same theological or cult premise as Nazism, namely the Tibetan masters and of Masonry, all that. And now there's evidence, a lot of evidence, to suggest that he was set up by Allen Dulles to do that. George Adamski. Carl Jung also was into UFOs. That was, and Carl Jung was an agent of, the famous psychologist was an agent of Allen Dulles, the CIA director. So Allen Dulles has his hand in all these different pies, and he's helping to foment this alien ET gospel where these Aryan-looking types. And when George Adamski met this supposed Venusian in the California desert, he noted the swastika on his boots. And he ends up going into being taken on a ride in a spaceship. That's the story. And he's indoctrinated, well, wouldn't you know it, about the Aryan Gnostic Jesus. Over the course of the 50s, 60s, 70s, people start to have these abduction experiences in which they're either encountering, or at first encountering, tall blonde Aryan types who are all receiving the same Nazi Aryan Gnostic gospel about Jesus. And gradually you start finding the gray aliens introduced in the mix. And there's a lot of, the rabbit hole and confusion potentially goes deep on this one, where you're confronted with the question of, are they partnering with spiritual agencies? Because even all of the leading researchers on these, including John Mack of Harvard, and they will end up concluding that there's something spiritual to this phenomena, interdimensional. It's just not beings from other planets, and that it's real and it's happening. But then there's also all of this evidence to indicate that some of these events are staged, that we're dealing with advanced craft from our own government and movie-like staged operations of sowing the Gnostic gospel, of experimenting on people, because the same trauma they report are, and then some of the same people that were even in the church committee hearings in the late 70s to investigate CIA corruption, it was learned that some of the people who were victims of MK Ultra were also reported abductees. And there's all kinds of overlap. So it appears that some of it was fake, some of it was, well, in a sense, real, or a real spiritual phenomena, and you're dealing with the same deceptive agencies. See, and this is what I love about the biblical narrative, is it gives you a robust, comprehensive roadmap to see what's going on with the spiritual war, to understand what's motivating all of this at a deep level. And
well, and even in those situations where these blonde-haired, blue-eyed beings are appearing, you know, the Bible's pretty clear. Satan masks as an angel of light, so that seems to pretty well hit it on the head right there. Like that's
yeah. And when I mean the Gnostic gospel, they've been consistently pushing the Gnostic gospel. These aliens, supposed, whether it's grays or whether it's the tall blondes, you know, why? I ask yourself, why is Jesus continually the object of an ongoing information warfare?
Right. Well, and it's like, it's so, the sleight of hand is so obvious. It's like, it's nothing new. It's just that, which is, you know, if you understand the way that the enemy works, like, you can't create anything. He can only distort and manipulate what already is. So it's like, if you look at the thread, it just takes the truth and spins it to its own opposing ideology or viewpoint or agenda or whatever.
Babel's counterfeit Christology pattern. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because there is nothing new to it. If you've been keeping track of this history, which actually very few people have, relatively. That's the issue. I think we're in a unique position in history now where we can see this uninterrupted thread, plot line, however complex it's become, we can find it in its simplified form, stretching all the way back to especially Jesus' time, because they are regurgitating the same. It's almost as if they're spending their ammunition. They've spent it. And if only people would point this out, we have something huge here, unprecedented in its implications for those who would want to, see the truth for what it is, objectively.
Right. It's like if this was a history course offered in a university, it would completely pull the wool off of our eyes and completely reframe our entire understanding of where we came from. Like, it's so obvious. It's so it's such an obvious thread that behind every move, that these things that are seemingly random, that we think these great evils, like, no, they all are very rooted in this, all in this same thread.
The reality speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because at some point I'm going to push. I think this needs to become its own field of study in seminary, if we're going to have seminaries.
Yeah.
Which I don't like making. I think scholarship is useful. And
well, I just think that the whole educational system is about to change.
It should.
Because it has to. It's because it's rooted in this. So the new thing is going to have to change to remove all of this junk that's in it, and then re-educate the people as far as what actually history looked like and how. Because now we're clued in, because of COVID and because of the last however many years.
We're going to need to do like a whole special episode on how each of these areas of culture shaping importance, education, for each of them almost, how they need to be reformed, because there's so much to be said on each of those. And in education, I used to do I had done my internship coming right out of during grad school with a college president, and he would always tell me, us Christian schools, we're only one law away from being shut down. We walk and I didn't understand it then. I can all see it in retrospect now, but it was clear how much pressure Christian colleges and universities have been under collectively. In fact, there's something called the CCCU, Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, to bow to what I'm going to refer to Babel system, which revolves around these Ivy League schools that Skull and Bones and them all took over.
Totally.
And some things we need to actually have in Christian colleges and universities, if we're going to make that distinction at all. We need to have a whole course which shows spiritual warfare manifesting throughout history. Those two have never been properly joined. But there's so much information now. In fact, what's taken me so long to write this book was I was juggling so much information, and I didn't know, it's like I would constantly come to realize, oh my goodness, there's just more and more popping up every minute. But it's especially accelerating for such a time as this. Now, if you want, we could make a whole episode next time on how this 1950s program I just described with the CIA and with NASA is now, history is repeating itself right now. And in a way that's even more dangerous because of the public agenda they're trying to push and propagate with it, which is, and I forgot to mention this last time when I was giving the preview, but let me just say this much again. The UFO, the mainstreamization of the UFO narrative, which I really like in many ways because it's forcing a lot of this conversation out into the open. The problem is that since its beginning in 2017, which began with the New York Times, there is a very specific group of people that have been undergirding this disclosure movement, who have been spearheading it and planting their spokesman, their journalist that will abide by their narrative in all of the right places. And I have a clear cut, I could go through it all with you, the persons who are involved in that, their connections to the CIA, to these very programs, as the second generation of them. And it isn't that they are just wanting to talk about UFOs and get serious about the subject, which I think is legitimate. They are at the same time pushing Babel's agenda, and sometimes, many times, in not so subtle terms. In fact, if there's only one piece of this I could share right now, it would be the urgency of this conversation is that for more than one of them, I've heard them begin to push the narrative that we were genetically seeded by, even specifically, a tall, white, blonde race that continues to help the aerospace program at its deepest levels in engineering and that sort of thing, associated with the Sirius star system. I heard a woman who's been a big voice in this disclosure movement say that, of course, she's not going to share her sources, but she says, but my sources, inside sources who are part of this, have even made those specifications. And then I there are guys like, I'll just name drop at this point, Lou Elizondo, who's been on Fox, CNN, all of these different, he's kind of been branded as a whistleblower, in fact, and for doing the right thing. And it's time we get serious about this conversation. But even he has been on different podcasts, has been inserting this narrative that, there's a lot of stuff people would have a hard time handling. And he subtly blames it on maybe the Judeo-Christian heritage. And he says, but, even our genetic, and he speaks of it so factually, like, I'm an insider, I know what I'm talking about. And he's just one example of what we're getting. And and then even News Nation, who kind of seemingly comes out of nowhere as a non-mainstream media platform, but you're seeing it's the same people from CNN. It's as if they were created for some of these people who have to jump ship from the mainstream media, but they're just flipping ship.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, if you want to, we could get into that if you want next time, but
okay. So
whatever you want to talk about now.
Yeah. My question is if it's, it's big into this white, Aryan, blue-eyed, blonde-haired entities, where are the grays coming from? Where, are they one and the same? Like, I guess I'm having trouble with that distinction there.
No, that's a good question. There's a lot, even amongst people who are really attentive to this topic, there's a lot of debate. There seems to be this idea that, and it's going to depend a lot whether you're coming from a biblical worldview or Babel's. And it really does only boil down to one of the other. But, some would say that they're like androids, like biologically complex creatures. And that narrative was even seeded by Corso, who wrote the book The Day After Roswell. Well, at least he talked about their biological systems were amazing, that they lacked, any kind of anatomy suggesting their natural biological entity, that they were created or engineered or, and then from a Christian point of view, we might say, well, yeah, maybe we're looking at physical bodies of interdimensional capability that are needed by demonic entities for their activity on this plane.
Gotcha.
And also, by the way, from the 1940s or 50s, whichever it was, we even have FBI documents that have been disclosed, top secret, classified files on these interdimensional beings who are tall and human-like, that are able to manifest in this plane by the laws of vibration, the file actually specified. So these are all the spiritual mechanics, that we've been kind of dealing in and talking about. and that these are a friendly race is what this FBI document was saying, and it was written by an anonymous ranking university department head or former department head that was in the loop. And what else did the document say? But it's just interesting that they're tall, that they contemplate, settling on this plane with us. So it's really kind of like the days of Noah, the attempt, their last ditch effort to mix with humankind again. It seems to be, and it seems to be consistent with all of their abduction activity, which revolves around a lot with genetics, genetic engineering, supposed hybrid programs you're hearing a lot about.
Yeah, what's that? What is that guy's name? Joseph. The Obama, and then they call him the prophet. I can't think of his name. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, he's a bald guy with the World Health Organization or World Economic Forum.
Yes,
and he it seems to be
what he's pushing. This idea of especially with
transhuman.
With AI and basically having vessels that could be inhabited, I guess, or
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean
Noah Harari, I think is the guy's name.
Yeah, right. Yep. Yeah. But it's just all, there is nothing new under the sun, but it's being presented as new, and it's all that this warfare of ideas has always been there. Now, I think you and I share the understanding that really this is a call for the church to be what it was meant to be all along and to step up. And, we I've talked a lot about this. We don't bow to the mindset that's become popular amongst Christians because of eschatology. I think a misguided eschatology that has led many to think that the world is supposed to go to hell in a handbasket. Darkness is supposed to consume the earth. But that even as darkness intensifies, or at least in its plots, that's our call to rise and shine. And to be agents of positive change on earth.
And I think that's why there's this resurgence of importance of the Book of Enoch that's happening right now amongst a lot of prophetic, high prophetic voices, Johnny Enlow and Lou Engle and Andrew Whalen, and specifically because the narrative of that book is the tribulation against the principalities, the tribulation against the forces of evil, and the massive just kingdom move and healing and fruitfulness and abundance that happens in the midst of that to God's people, and that being the reason that was removed, so that this other narrative could continue, and eschatologies could develop in which we're just going to be swooped away at any time. The rapture is going to happen.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's about the wicked, the removal of the wicked. Yeah. That, even for the biblical authors, that Book of Enoch was so pivotal to establishing the proper framework of the spiritual war we find ourselves in that's always come against mankind, that has always been a most sensitive area of information warfare that they have invested themselves in. In fact, the indications are that the Masons even had their own copies. They had found and discovered copies in Ethiopia of the Book of Enoch in the late 1700s and kept them secret.
Wow.
And because they understood the implications of it. And I think, as Johnny mentioned even the other day, there are, there have been certain books that have never been published because the rights to them have been purchased because of the amount but yes, you hit it right on the nail, and that is the fact that Enoch defines the last days as the removal of the wicked. But what is so amazing is
we're there
the Bible does too.
We're there. Well, yes, and we're there to watch it. And in fact, we're there to enjoy the spoils and enjoy the it's like God,
to be part of it.
Yes, God's glory on display and all that sort of.
We are His chosen vehicle for it all, even.
Yeah.
And so I've been really enjoying. I think I remember mentioning this one bit. I've been reading. I really love reading through the Psalms, the prophets. Well, I love it. I love the Old Testament. I've fallen so deeply in love with it because once you understand what it's getting at, it's amazing news for mankind. That's what God is so picky about and trying to defend. And so I've been reading through, recently I happen to have been, I've been reading through Isaiah and Jeremiah. And as the Old Testament narrative builds, one prophet builds on the foundation laid by the other. We get it gets clearer and clearer and clearer that the last days are being defined as a period, whereas it means the last days for the wicked. God is using that as these are going to be your last days.
Yeah.
To the extent that, really what it boils down to is to the extent that my people are truly transformed of heart, circumcised of heart, as is the term of this plot line since Deuteronomy, and they grow in wisdom and have a heart of understanding, a listening mind, which is what Solomon had, as they grow in wisdom and become agents of positive change and lead this Abrahamic revolution against Babel's demigods and god kings and enslaving system. When they step up to the plate, it's going to mean the last days for the wicked. They're terrified of this. There's even this beautiful verse in, I think, Jeremiah 50, Marduk is terrified. That it was Nimrod deified of the Enuma Marduk. Wow. So Marduk shakes in terror.
Well, and it's
These gods are terrified.
And the thing is, we've been so blinded in all aspects of society, including the church.
Yes.
That it's like how we haven't really been given the, it says my people perish for lack of knowledge. We've been perishing pretty heavily. We've been thriving. We will thrive as the children of God. But it's like there's this ignorance to the truth that's happened that's kept us from operating in our full potential.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like right now in the culture, all the people who don't see all the propaganda, it's like they're living in a fantasy world. And until they see, it's like, they direct their hatred and disgust and all their protests towards the wrong thing. And it's like if they were ever to wake up, the madness and the anger in the streets towards the people that are actually, it would be a complete game changer for, it would be a tipping point. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's almost like, how would you, one of the things I almost think about doing is going around and interviewing people and asking certain questions like, how pissed would you be to find out that you could be living like a millionaire right now? That the resources, the tech's available for all of us to be living abundantly.
Yeah. Oh, and all of the...
And to have our free time to find our passion and to connect with our skill.
All of your relatives that have died of cancer or suffered, meaning... I was
going to say that.
All of that's available. The remedies and solutions to that are all available and are hidden from you.
Oh, Jeff, I'm so glad that you brought that up. Okay, I'm going to make a point, and if I forget to, remind me to just say something about George Washington Carver, the scientist. He's a model citizen of what you and I are talking about here. Okay, but what I was going to say before George Washington Carver was that you were right to mention that verse, "My people perish for lack of knowledge." The reason that is so spot on is because that is what, when you peel back all the layers of brainwashing that went into the church from Babel's infiltrators, the Gnostics, that is where they sabotaged us. Yep. That is where they pulled the rug out from under us, was to make us doubt our understanding of what knowledge even is and our epistemological standard. This is worth recapturing. From Mount Sinai, from the Exodus, God gave mankind the tools, the ordinary people, starting with his people, which he needed to strategically start with a people, separate them from Babel's system. He started to give them the tools of proper epistemology. How do you know what you know? And public knowledge, public accountability, where you have all of the people standing at Mount Sinai, and he starts to emphasize, you yourselves saw what just happened. I just brought the gods of Egypt on trial, public trial. I didn't just talk about being the creator God. I showed it. I went through each one of their deities and dismantled them one by one. You all saw it.
And very public, very symbologically significant ways. There's no
kinds of ways.
There's no doubt of what if you know the gods and their symbols and their it's all there. It's obvious what he's doing.
And so he thoroughly won that court case, and it is amazing. Isaiah, the whole book of Isaiah, invites us. It's written in the context of a court case. God's bringing the gods of Babel to court. Whereas in the Exodus, he brought the gods of Egypt to court. Same thing. He brings all of the world's idolatrous gods to court, and their astrologers. And this is what's meant when he says the moon and the stars and the sun will not cast their light. In other words, your astrologers aren't going to be able to keep up with me. He invites the readers, the listeners, even a future generation. Isaiah 38 says, pay attention to history's course, and we're going to see how this turns out. He says, I'm telling you ahead of time, here's how certain things are going to go. And I'm putting it on the record, the public record. And you guys are going to be my witnesses. You, Israel, and then later, you, all of the distant islands, the ends of the earth, even the Gentile nations. So the whole biblical plot line is edifying us, and the normal, ordinary people with the tools for the power of literacy, of history, documenting, everything that will need to go into having a complete picture. In fact, and of course, even a documentary called the Exodus, I think something like Patterns of Exodus by Thinking Man Ministries, something of that is a great. It's called Patterns of Evidence: The Moses Controversy. Amazing, and it lays out this groundbreaking case, which says actually the Bible got the timing and dates right, and all of the mainstream narrative in academia has it wrong because they're at conflict with each other. And it makes the case that Moses actually gave, at Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the tools for a alphabet, like a phonetic alphabet, a Proto-Hebrew that even kids could learn. He gave the normal people the gift of mankind, or the gift of literacy,
right,
to create this long-term process of holding history and its course to account in light of the knowledge of God and to build the case.
Wow.
Amazing stuff. So, yes. I mean, we've got a lot of catching up to do. I think that's what we're saying.
That's good. Yeah, I think that's really good. It's good kind of bringing it back to victory. You know, it can easily bog you down seeing what the enemy is doing and what all these things are unveiling, but keeping it in perspective of like it's futile, you know.
Yeah, and just let me at least, if you want to close now, that's cool. But let me just close then with the George Washington Carver point.
There you go. Yeah,
he is Babel's worst nightmare. He was the. It would be easy to understand in what sense he would be the a white supremacist Aryan elite's worst nightmare, high masonry's worst nightmare. Worth reading the autobiographical material of George Washington Carver, the peanut scientist and inventor who lived in the early 20th century, 1900s. He invented he was a very devoted follower of Christ, a black man. He was even honored as the Black Leonardo da Vinci by Time magazine in 1940s. And this guy, from when he was a little kid, had an amazing prayer life where he would walk in the field. And he was very inventive. He couldn't afford art supplies, so he'd go out to the woods. He would find different berries, flowers, make his own dyes and art kit and writing kit. And he's just a genius. Yeah. But he ends up revolutionizing the Southern economy, saving it from a crisis with all of the different secrets he unlocked of the peanuts' unique qualities, and over 300 some inventions and applications of the peanut. And, he's very forthright in his autobiographical material about how this came about. He said he was walking one day with God and in a field, and he said, God, could you show me the secrets of the universe, how it all works? And this is how he's relaying it. He says, a voice said to me, well, that's a little bit beyond you right now, or something like that. It's kind of big for your britches. And so he happened to be standing next to a peanut field. So Carver says, all right, well, can you show me the secrets of a peanut? And God said, that's more your size. And the moral of the story is that his prayer life didn't end in those little walks. It came with him into his laboratory. So I have all of these amazing quotes, which I include in my book from him, where he's talking about how God would give him these ideas and they would talk back and forth in the laboratory as he's working. And what is so amazing about him is he said, he talked all about nature's voice being God's like broadcasting tool. Mm. And he says, I especially love studying the plant, animal, and mineral kingdoms. I find it one of the most eye-opening tools that God uses to speak to me and tell me about his kingdom and just his way of doing things. Mm. And where have we heard of this before? Well, this is part of what accounted for Solomon's great ingenuity and brilliance. He especially loved studying plants and animals and that, but especially plants. And there's something about even the early the Nazi scientists who helped develop the Vril levitation unit, Schauberger, was deeply intrigued with plants, and even the Vril people studied the nature of plants. So the bottom line is there's something so deep about plants that it attracts these genius people. But George Washington Carver understood that all in its proper context. And he said, no, this is Jesus, the creator, who is the rightful source of all of this wisdom. And, George Washington Carver just flourished. So while you hear him celebrated and, even in things like nobody talks about this backstory. But George Washington Carver was very careful to glorify God in everything and to say, look, there's no secret to it. It's just, and he even said, people who don't believe in Christ got to be baffled, but it's just not that complicated. This is the will of God, is to flourish in everything. And this is, what it means to follow Jesus for different people. As a musician, Jeff, you're going to do that in music and so on and so forth with other people in engineering, but God's in it all and he's interested in it all. And if we did our job, if we had more people like Martin Luther King Jr., like George Washington Carver, who understood the gospel's implications for culture, it would be game over. It would be the last days for the wicked. Yeah. It would be a nightmare for Babel's elite.
That's good.